4:15 in the morning, the Arabian Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln was already vibrating with the power of 4 nuclear reactors as it turned into the wind for the morning's first flight operations. The routine of the carrier deck was shattered when a single, high-frequency alert screamed through the Combat Information Center, signaling a launch from the Iranian coast that defied every known flight profile in the region. Something was moving across the Persian Gulf at a speed that made conventional tracking look like it was standing still. The air over the flight deck was heavy with humidity and the sharp, chemical smell of JP-5 jet fuel. Outside the steel walls of the hull, the Arabian Sea was a black, oily mirror reflecting a moonless sky. But on the glowing screens, deep within the ship, a digital ghost was screaming toward them at 7,000 miles per hour. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center did not hesitate. He recognized the signature immediately as a Fata-2 hypersonic glide vehicle, a weapon designed to maneuver within the atmosphere to bypass traditional ballistic missile defenses. The contact had appeared on the AN/SPY-6 radar array as a flickering violet streak, already reaching an altitude of 30,000 meters before beginning its terminal descent. 150 miles to the north, the escorting destroyer DDG-114, the USS Ralph Johnson, attempted to establish a firm track, but the missile was already performing a high-G atmospheric skip that confused the initial targeting solution. Inside the Lincoln, the call for general quarters echoed through every compartment. The sound of the alarm was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that sent 5,000 sailors racing to their stations. Steel hatches were slammed and dogged shut. In the hangar bay, technicians dropped their tools and scrambled for the nearest ladder wells. The ship's commanding officer reached the bridge exactly 45 seconds after the first alert. He did not ask for a status report. He looked at the primary tactical display and saw the projected intercept point. The computer was placing the impact directly on the carrier's port side, just below the flight deck level. The carrier strike group began to react with the choreographed precision of 100 years of naval doctrine. The cruiser, CG-73, the USS Port Royal, unleashed the first defensive salvo. 2 Standard missile, 6 interceptors, tore out of the Mark 41 vertical launch system, their rocket motors illuminating the dark sea with a blinding white glare. The missiles climbed into the upper atmosphere, guided by the coordinated processing power of the entire strike group's Aegis combat system. But the Iranian weapon was not following a predictable arc. As the interceptors closed the distance, the hypersonic vehicle executed a pre-programmed lateral shift, pulling 18 times the force of gravity. The Standard missiles missed by less than 300 meters, their proximity fuses failing to trigger against a target moving at Mach 10. On the bridge of the Lincoln, the atmosphere was one of cold, professional intensity. There was no shouting. The helmsman executed a hard turn to starboard, attempting to present the smallest possible cross-section to the incoming threat while maximizing the arc of the ship's own close-in weapon systems. The carrier began to heel over, the deck slanting at an angle of 12 degrees. In the galley and the berthing areas, unbolted equipment began to slide and crash against the bulkheads. Every sailor on board could feel the massive ship straining against the water, the 4 propeller shafts pushing the 100,000-ton vessel to its limit of 32 knots. The threat was now 60 miles away. The time to impact was measured in less than 40 seconds. The tactical action officer authorized the release of the rolling airframe missiles and the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. The launchers on the Lincoln sponsons rotated with a mechanical whine, tracking the invisible point in the sky where the radar predicted the missile would be. White smoke and orange flame erupted from the side of the carrier as the short-range interceptors were lofted into the path of the intruder. Deep in the heart of the ship, the damage control teams donned their fire retardant suits and strapped on their oxygen bottles. They stood in the dim red light of the damage control lockers, listening to the muffled roar of the interceptors being launched overhead. They knew that, if the outer layers of the shield failed, they were the only thing that would keep the ship from sinking. The air in the 10 passageways was suddenly very still, the only sound being the distant, high-pitched whine of the ship's turbines. 10 miles out, the hypersonic vehicle began its final plunge. It was glowing with the heat of atmospheric friction, a man-made meteor traveling at 3 kilometers per second. The Lincoln's close-in weapon systems, the 20mm Gatling guns, began to traverse, their radar brains calculating a lead angle for a target that was almost too fast for the motors to track. The question was no longer if the strike group could stop the missile, but how much of the Lincoln would be left after the energy of the impact was unleashed. The Aegis combat system was the primary line of defense for the USS Abraham Lincoln, acting as a digital brain that linked every ship in the strike group into a single, unified sensor network. This system allowed the destroyer DDG-114, the USS Ralph Johnson, to pass high-resolution tracking data directly to the carrier's own weapon systems via the cooperative engagement capability. The ANSPY-6 radar arrays on the escorting vessels were pushing electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere at maximum power, attempting to pierce the ionized plasma sheath that surrounded the Iranian Fateh II missile. This plasma, created by the intense friction of Mach 10 flight, acted as a natural stealth shield that absorbed and scattered radar waves, making a continuous target lock nearly impossible to maintain. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Lincoln, the air was chilled to 60 degrees to protect the massive computer processors, but the operators were sweating beneath their headsets. The tactical action officer watched the violet track on his display as it jumped and flickered, the result of the missile's unpredictable atmospheric skips. Every 5 seconds, the missile changed its heading by a fraction of a degree, a maneuver that at 5,000 miles per hour translated into a displacement of several miles. The Aegis system was forced to constantly recalculate the intercept solution, a task that pushed the processing architecture to its absolute limits. The strike group's electronic warfare suite, the SLQ-32, was now active in its highest intensity mode. High-gain antennas on the carrier's island and the escorting cruiser were blasting focused beams of radio frequency energy at the incoming threat, attempting to blind the missile's own internal radar seeker. On the flight deck, the EA-18 Golf Growlers that had been preparing for launch were now acting as stationary jamming platforms, their powerful pods adding to the electronic wall. The environment around the carrier was a chaotic storm of invisible energy, a desperate attempt to convince the missile's guidance computer that the Lincoln was miles away from its actual position. The air around the ship was now thick with the smell of ionized air and the ozone from high-voltage electronics as the cooling systems worked at their maximum capacity. Despite the electronic interference, the Fateh II held its course, guided by a hardened inertial navigation system that was resistant to external jamming. The weapon was now 30 miles out, descending through 40,000 feet. The second layer of the defensive wall, the evolved Sea Sparrow missile system, was engaged. 24 missiles were launched in rapid succession from the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the escorting ships, creating a dense pattern of interceptors in the sky. Each evolved Sea Sparrow missile was a white-hot dart of kinetic energy, guided by the reflected radar energy from the strike group's illuminators. The missiles reached Mach 4 in seconds. There, solid fuel motors leaving thick white trails that crisscrossed the dark morning sky. The operators in the Combat Information Center watched as the clusters of friendly blue icons closed in on the single, terrifying red icon of the Iranian missile. It was a statistical battle, a game of probabilities played out at hypersonic speeds, where a microsecond of lag meant the difference between a successful intercept and a catastrophic failure. The sound of the engagement was a series of distant, rolling thuds that could be heard even through the thick steel hull of the carrier. High above the water, 3 of the Sea Sparrow missiles successfully detonated within the proximity of the target, but the hypersonic vehicle was built with a reinforced heat shield designed to withstand the thermal stress of re-entry. The shrapnel from the interceptors pinged off the missile's hardened skin like hail on an armored roof. The weapon was shredded in several places, but its core structure remained intact, and its momentum carried it forward toward the carrier at over 2,000 meters per second. The final defensive layer was the rolling airframe missile, launched from the carrier's own sponsons. These small, agile missiles were designed to home in on the infrared signature of the threat, but the plasma sheath around the Fatah II was so hot that the seekers were momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the heat. The Lincoln was now cantonné, defenseless in the face of the final approach. The commanding officer gripped the edge of the navigation bridge console, his eyes fixed on the forward-looking infrared camera feed. The screen was almost entirely white as the heat of the incoming missile filled the frame. In the final 5 miles, the ship's internal communications fell silent. The sailors in the engine rooms and the hangar bays braced themselves, holding onto whatever fixed machinery they could find. They knew the math. A 1-ton object moving at Mach 10 carried as much kinetic energy as a dozen heavy bombs. The impact was no longer a possibility. It was a physical certainty. The Arabian Sea, usually a place of movement and noise, felt suddenly and unnervingly still in the microsecond before the world began to tear apart. 4:22 in the morning. The Arabian Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln was struck on the port side, just aft of the midship line, by the remaining mass of the Fatah II hypersonic glide vehicle. The impact was not a single explosion, but a catastrophic transfer of kinetic energy that turned thousands of pounds of high-grade steel into a white-hot spray of molten shrapnel in less than a millisecond. Because the weapon was moving at Mach 10, the force of the collision carried 45 gigajoules of energy, a number equivalent to the detonation of 10 tons of high explosives, concentrated into a single point the size of a man's chest. The air around the impact point was instantly vaporized, replaced by a vacuum that then collapsed with a roar that cracked the armored glass on the bridge, 6 levels above. The smell of burnt ozone, vaporized paint, and the metallic tang of molten steel filled the ship's ventilation system in an instant. The missile punched through the outer hull, which was composed of 6 inches of reinforced steel, as if it were parchment. It continued its travel through 3 interior bulkheads and 2 storage compartments before finally detonating its high-explosive warhead inside the hangar deck. The internal blast was confined by the ship's heavy structural frames, which forced the pressure upward and outward. The hangar deck, a cavernous space usually filled with the sounds of maintenance and aviation routine, became a furnace, a wall of fire, fueled by the residual propellant in the missile and the fuel lines of 3 parked F-35 Charlie Lightning. 2 fighters surged through the space at the speed of sound. The shockwave traveled through the hull at 5,000 meters per second, faster than any human could react. Sailors standing hundreds of feet from the impact were thrown from their feet, their bodies slamming against bulkheads with bone-breaking force. In the main engine rooms, the massive reduction gears groaned under the sudden misalignment of the propeller shafts. The deck beneath the feet of the damage control teams buckled upward by 6 inches, tearing through electrical conduits and showering the compartments in arcs of blue and white sparks. The Abraham Lincoln, 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered sovereignty, shuddered with a violence that felt as if the ship had run aground on a mountain of solid rock. In the hangar bay, the scene was one of disciplined chaos. The automated fire suppression systems, including the high-capacity aqueous film-forming foam sprayers, activated within 3 seconds of the blast. A thick, white chemical fog began to rain down from the overhead, battling a fire that was reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees. Through the thick smoke, the silhouettes of burning aircraft were visible, their composite airframes melting into black, toxic puddles. The ship's lighting failed in the impact zone, leaving the damage control teams to work by the flickering orange light of the fires and the beams of their handheld lanterns. Below the waterline, the damage was severe but not immediately fatal. The missile had created a jagged hole in the hull 6 meters wide. Thousands of tons of seawater began to pour into the lower storage levels, causing the ship to take on an immediate 3-degree list to port. The automatic watertight doors had functioned as designed, sealing off the flooded compartments, but the pressure of the incoming water was screaming against the interior bulkheads. The ship's master helmsman fought the controls as the steering gear became sluggish, the Lincoln losing its ability to maneuver effectively as the drag from the breached hull increased. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the damage control board turn from green to a sea of flashing red. Reports were coming in of heavy casualties in the hangar bay and the adjacent berthing areas. The carrier's primary flight deck remained structurally sound, but the smoke rising from the elevator wells make flight operations impossible. The crown jewel of the United States Navy was no longer an aggressor. It was a wounded giant, fighting for its life in the middle of a dark and hostile sea. The heat from the fire began to bake steel of the flight deck from below, causing the non-skid surface to bubble and peel. Above the ship, the moonless sky remained indifferent, but the Arabian Sea was no longer a mirror. It was a battlefield, and the first blow had landed with a weight that changed the strategic calculus of the entire theater. The sailors of the Lincoln, from the youngest airman to the highest-ranking officer, were now locked in. A battle against fire and water that would determine if the ship lived to see the sunrise. 4:38 in the morning. Below the hangar deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the air in the lower passageways was a suffocating mixture of humidity, the metallic tang of blood, and the acrid yellow smoke of burning hydraulic fluid. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams catching the thick mist of the aqueous film-forming foam that was now 6 inches deep on the deck. Damage control teams, clad in heavy fire-retardant suits that made them look like faceless ghosts, moved toward the impact zone. They worked in the red glow of emergency lighting, their boots splashing through a cocktail of seawater and jet fuel. Every 30 seconds, the ship would groan a deep, structural sound of twisting metal that vibrated through the soles of their feet as the hull adjusted to the weight of thousands of tons of incoming seawater. In the primary triage station, located in the ship's medical ward 3 levels below the flight deck, the scene was one of grim, focused intensity. The first wave of casualties had arrived within 10 minutes of the impact. The medical staff, their blue scrubs already stained dark, worked under the hum of emergency generators. They were treating a horrifying array of injuries: third-degree flash burns from the initial fireball, compound fractures from the shockwave, and the hollow-eyed stare of sailors suffering from severe concussions. The smell of medicinal alcohol and burnt flesh was overpowering. There was no screaming, only the rhythmic hiss of oxygen concentrators and the steady, low-voiced commands of the surgeons as they triaged the wounded. Below the waterline, in the flooded compartments of the portside storage bays, the battle was against the ocean itself. The impact had shattered the main fire main, a 14-inch pipe that carried pressurized seawater for firefighting. Now, that same pipe was geysering thousands of gallons of water into the ship every minute, compounding the flooding from the hull breach. A damage control petty officer, his face smeared with grease and soot, led a team into the knee-deep water. They were carrying J-pumps and wooden shoring heavy beams of Douglas fir designed to expand when wet. They hammered the shoring into place against a buckled bulkhead, the sound of their mallets echoing like gunshots in the confined space. "Hold the line," the petty officer shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of rushing water. The bulkhead was weeping, a fine spray of high-pressure seawater shooting through a hairline crack. If that wall failed, the flooding would reach the auxiliary machinery room, and the Lincoln would lose its remaining steering control. The team worked with a desperate, rhythmic speed, wedging the wooden beams into a complex K-type structure to distribute the pressure of the sea. The wood groaned as it took the load, the fibers screaming under the weight of the Arabian Sea, pressing against the other side of the steel. On the bridge, the executive officer coordinated the counter-flooding. To correct the 3-degree list to port, the ship began pumping thousands of tons of fuel and ballast water into the starboard tanks. It was a delicate, dangerous dance of physics. If they overcompensated, the ship could lose stability and roll. The Lincoln slowly began to right itself. the deck leveling out as the weight shifted, but the cost was a loss of speed. The drag from the jagged metal of the hull breach was like an anchor, slowing the carrier to 15 knots. The vibration from the misaligned port propeller shaft grew worse, a rhythmic thumping that threatened to shake the bearings apart. Communication was a patchwork of sound. The primary, internal phones were dead in the midship section, forcing runners to carry handwritten messages from the damage control lockers to the bridge. These young sailors, some no older than 19, raced through smoke-filled corridors. Their faces etched with the corridor's realization that the safety of the world's most powerful warship now rested on their ability to keep moving. They passed. The bodies of those who had been in the direct path of the blast, covered now in gray wool blankets, lined up in the passageways with a silent, terrible dignity. By 5 in the morning, the fires in the hangar bay were under control, though the space remained a blackened graveyard of melted aircraft and twisted ordnance. The immediate threat of sinking had been halted by the shoring teams, but the Lincoln was a shadow of its former self. Its radar was functioning, its reactors were hot, but its teeth, the air wing, were trapped behind jammed elevator doors and thick smoke. The carrier was no longer an island of safety. It was a target that could not outrun its enemies. The sun would be up in 90 minutes, and with the light would come the realization that the shield had been broken. 5:15 in the morning. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia, and the United States Central Command Forward Headquarters in Qatar. The news of the impact on the USS Abraham Lincoln reached the National Military Command Center in seconds. On the high-resolution displays, the status of the carrier had changed from a bright blue icon to a pulsing yellow, indicating major damage. In the secure conference rooms, the atmosphere was one of controlled, professional fury. This was not a localized skirmish. It was a direct, high-end strike against a symbol of American power. The Secretary of Defense, linked via a secure video teleconference to the commander of Indo-Pacific Command and the Fifth Fleet, did not waste time with formalities. The president had already issued the execution order. Operation Lightning Shield was no longer a defensive posture. It was now a retaliatory campaign. The mission objective was clear and clinical: neutralize the Iranian long-range strike capability. Specifically, the target was the 3rd Missile Brigade of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, including the RQ-4 Global Hawk drones and specialized signals intelligence satellites, had already triangulated the source of the hypersonic launch. The mobile transporter erector launchers were hidden within the rugged, limestone canyons of the Zagros Mountains, just north of Bandar Abbas. These batteries were protected by a dense network of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, a sophisticated system capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously. "We are not looking for a proportionate response," the Fifth Fleet commander stated, his voice flat and steady over the encrypted line. "We are looking for an absolute termination of the threat. If they have a second missile on a rail, it must be destroyed before the engine ignites." On board the USS Abraham Lincoln, the command structure was already pivoting. Despite the damage to the hangar deck, the carrier's nuclear reactors were providing full power to the catapults. The Air Wing commander, known by his call sign Claw, stood in the darkened ready room. His pilots were already in their flight suits, their faces illuminated by the glow of their handheld tablets. The plan was a response in kind. While the carrier's portside elevator was jammed, elevators 1 and 2 were still operational. The deck crew, working in the acrid smoke still rising from the hangar, began the grueling task of manhandling F-35 Charlie Lightning II fighters onto the 4-acre flight deck. The strike package would be complex. It required the integration of the Lincoln's remaining air wing with land-based assets from Al Udeid Air Base. The F-35 Charlies would lead the way, using their stealth profiles to penetrate the outer rim of the Iranian integrated air defense system. Behind them, a second wave of FA-18 Gulf Growlers would provide the electronic blanket, suppressing the Iranian radars with high-power jamming. Finally, the escorting destroyers, the USS Ralph Johnson and the USS Mason would provide the heavy lifting, preparing to launch a volley of 60 Tomahawk land attack missiles. The logistics of the retaliation were staggering. Every missile, every gallon of fuel, and every target coordinate had to be verified in real time. The Air Operations Center in Qatar was managing a three-dimensional chessboard that spanned hundreds of miles of airspace. They had to account for civilian air traffic, neutral territorial waters, and the overlapping engagement zones of the Iranian batteries. The coordinates were locked: 27 degrees 15 minutes north, 56 degrees 18 minutes east. At 5:45 in the morning, the order was flashed to the strike group. The words "batteries release" appeared on the tactical displays of every ship and aircraft. On the deck of the Lincoln, the first F-35 Charlie moved into position on catapult number 1. The blast deflector shield rose from the deck, a wall of steel catching the roar of the single Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine. The pilot gave a crisp salute to the catapult officer. In the cockpit, the interface showed a clean green status for the internal weapons bay, which carried two 2,000-pound GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. The launch was a physical release of tension for the entire ship. The catapult fired with a rhythmic thwack that shook the forward part of the hull. The stealth fighter was slung into the dark morning sky, its afterburner a violet needle of flame cutting through the sea mist. One by one, the aircraft followed, disappearing into the haze toward the Iranian coast. The Lincoln was wounded, and its blood was in the water. But its reach was still 300 miles long. The retaliation had begun, and the world was 12 minutes away from the first collision of the counterstrike. 6 in the morning, the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz. The 4 F-35 Charlie Lightning. 2 fighters from the USS Abraham Lincoln flew in a wide combat spread, their low observable profiles making them nearly invisible to the Iranian early warning radars scanning the coast. They were operating in beast mode, but with their weapons tucked inside internal bays to maintain their stealth signatures. The pilots were using their distributed aperture systems, which projected a 360-degree view of the battlefield directly onto their helmet visors. Below them, the rugged peaks of the Zagros Mountains were beginning to catch the first pale light of dawn, casting long, jagged shadows across the limestone canyons where the Iranian missile batteries lay hidden. At exactly 6:05, the Iranian Integrated Air Defense System woke up. The HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries near Bandar Abbas, alerted by passive infrared sensors, initiated a massive launch. The first HQ-9 missile tore off its vertical launch rail, with a deafening, high-pitched scream that echoed through the mountain passes. A massive column of orange flame and white smoke punched into the air, the heat of the launch scorching the surrounding scrubland instantly. 2 seconds later, 3 more missiles followed, their solid fuel motors creating 4 distinct white fingers reaching into the purple sky. The lead F-35 pilot saw the thermal bloom on his visor. "Vampire! Vampire!" he called out, his voice calm despite the master caution light flickering amber. He jammed the throttle forward, the F-135 engine responding with a roar that pushed him back into his seat as he banked the stealth fighter 60 degrees to the left. The first Iranian missile reached Mach 4 in seconds, its radar seeker head locked onto the faint electromagnetic ghost of the lead jet. It closed the distance of 20 miles in less than 15 seconds. The pilot waited until the last possible moment, then deployed a flare and chaff bundle while pulling a 9G brake turn. The HQ-9 warhead, 180 kilograms of high-explosive fragmentation, detonated exactly 50 meters behind the aircraft's tail. The shock wave slammed into the F-35 like a physical blow, the pressure wave rattling the pilot's teeth and momentarily blurring his vision. A spray of jagged steel fragments shredded the fighter's right horizontal stabilizer, sending a shower of carbon fiber debris spinning into the slipstream. The F-35 shivered but held its flight path. The pilot ignored the stabilizer fail warning on his primary display and stabilized the nose. "Lead is hit, but I'm still in the fight," he radioed. He leveled the wings and opened the internal weapons bay doors. 2 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions dropped from the belly of the jet, their guidance fins snapping open as they began their GPS-guided plunge toward the radar van below. 3 seconds later, the bomb struck the heart of the HQ-9 battery. A massive fireball erupted, a white-hot dome of overpressure that obliterated the radar dish, the command vehicle, and 2 nearby launch tubes in a single, crushing instant. Metal plates and burning tires were thrown 300 feet into the air as the secondary explosions of the remaining interceptor missiles began to cook off in a rhythmic series of deafening blasts. The remaining 3 F-35s followed the lead, dropping their ordnance on the pre-planned coordinates. The Iranian mobile launchers, the very units that had fired the hypersonic missile at the Lincoln, were caught in the middle of a reload cycle. The 2,000-pound bombs turned the heavy transport vehicles into scrap metal. The fuel tanks of the trucks erupted, sending rivers of burning diesel flowing down the canyon walls. The precision was absolute. Within 4 minutes, the 3rd Missile Brigade's primary launch site had been reduced to a smoking crater of twisted steel and scorched earth. The lead pilot looked back over his shoulder. The Iranian coast was now dotted with pillars of black smoke that rose straight into the windless morning air. The smell of burnt rubber and high explosives lingered in the cockpits of the jets as they climbed to 30,000 feet to clear the engagement zone. The integrated air defense icons on their screens were disappearing one by one, replaced by the neutralized symbol. But the mission was only half complete. Behind them, 60 Tomahawk missiles were already crossing the shoreline, their low-altitude flight paths taking them toward the backup command centers deeper inland. The F-35s turned south, heading back toward the wounded carrier. The lead pilot adjusted his trim to compensate for the damaged stabilizer, the aircraft handling like a wounded bird, but still maintaining its supersonic cruise. He looked down at the Arabian Sea, where the silhouette of the USS Abraham Lincoln was finally becoming visible through the morning haze. The ship was still trailing a thin ribbon of gray smoke, a reminder that while the strike was a success, the cost of the opening move had been paid in American steel. 6:30 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman and the Iranian coastline. The F-35 fighters had successfully punched a hole in the outer defensive shell, but the true weight of the United States' response was only now reaching the shore. 60 miles south of the Iranian coast, the destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, and the cruiser CG-73, the USS Port Royal, were operating at maximum combat readiness. The 2 ships were positioned 10 miles apart, their hulls cutting through the water at 20 knots to create a moving launch platform that was difficult for enemy shore batteries to target. The morning sun was now a low, orange disk on the horizon, turning the sea into a sheet of hammered copper and casting the long shadows of the warships across the white-capped waves. The command was issued through the secure Link 16 data chain. On the forward and aft decks of the USS Port Royal, the heavy steel covers of the Mark 41 vertical launch system snapped open with a series of metallic clanks. Within seconds, the first Tomahawk land attack missile ignited. The sound was not a scream, but a deep, vibrating roar that resonated through the ship's structure, a physical force that could be felt in the soles of the sailors' boots. A massive cloud of white exhaust and orange flame billowed out of the launch cells, momentarily obscuring the aft mast of the cruiser as the first missile climbed vertically toward the sky. The Tomahawks, each carrying a 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead, executed a programmed pitch-over maneuver at an altitude of 200 meters. They dropped back down toward the surface of the sea, their small turbofan engines kicking in with a high-pitched whine as they stabilized at a height of just 30 meters above the water. This sea-skimming profile made them nearly impossible for Iranian coastal radars to detect against the background clutter of the waves. One by one, 30 missiles followed from the Port Royal, followed by another 30 from the USS Arleigh Burke, creating a swarm of subsonic drones racing toward the Iranian mainland at 550 miles per hour. The target for this massive volley was the Iranian coastal surveillance network and the secondary command bunkers buried deep within the coastal cliffs. These facilities provided the eyes for any subsequent anti-ship missile strikes. The Tomahawks crossed the shoreline at exactly 6:42 in the morning, using their terrain contour matching systems to weave through the valleys and ridges of the coastline. The missiles flew so low that the pressure of their passage flattened the scrub brush and sent plumes of dust swirling behind them. Inside the Iranian command center at Jask, the alarms were constant, a discordant symphony of failure as one radar station after another went offline. The Tomahawks were arriving from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated time-on-target strike designed to overwhelm the remaining point defenses. As the missiles reached their final waypoints, they initiated a pop-up maneuver, climbing rapidly to 500 meters before diving straight down into their targets at a terminal velocity of 700 feet per second. The impacts were devastating. The first 3 missiles struck the primary radar installation on the heights of Cape Jask. The radar dish was sheared from its mountings by the blast, the reinforced concrete tower collapsing into a pile of rubble and twisted rebar. Seconds later, a cluster of 5 Tomahawks hit the main communications bunker. The warheads, equipped with delayed fuses, punched through 4 meters of earth and concrete before detonating. The ground above the bunker rose 3 feet and then collapsed. A muffled, earth-shaking thump, followed by a plume of black smoke and debris that rose 500 feet into the air. The environment around the Iranian coastal positions was transformed into a landscape of fire and thunder. The smell of burning electronics, pulverized concrete, and high explosives hung heavy in the humid morning air. The Iranian eyes were now effectively blind. The strike group had successfully established a sanitized zone around the wounded Lincoln, stripping the enemy of the ability to coordinate further long-range strikes. On the bridge of the Port Royal, the tactical action officer watched as the 60 blue icons on his screen reached their targets and winked out, replaced by the white markers of confirmed hits. The destroyers did not celebrate. They immediately began the process of reloading their data systems and monitoring for any remaining airborne threats. The air over the Arabian Sea was filled with the fading roar of the missile engines, leaving behind a silence that was broken only by the sound of the wind and the constant, rhythmic slapping of the sea against the steel hulls. The counterstrike was reaching its conclusion, but the Iranian leadership still had one more card to play: the swarm. 7:15 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 20 miles north of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The radar screen on the destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, was suddenly cluttered with dozens of small, high-speed contacts emerging from the coastal coves near Chabahar. These were the Wagamar fast attack craft of the Revolutionary Guard Navy. Small, fiberglass-hulled boats capable of 45 knots, each armed with multiple launch rocket systems and heavy machine guns. Behind them, a second wave of Ababil explosive suicide drones buzzed across the water like a mechanical swarm of locusts. The Iranian strategy had shifted from high-tech hypersonics to the thousand stings of asymmetric warfare, attempting to saturate the carrier's defenses by sheer volume. The first wave of 20 fast boats closed the distance at a suicidal pace, their wakes carving white scars across the deep blue water. The USS Arleigh Burke did not wait for them to reach missile range. The forward Mark 45 5-inch gun turret snapped into position with a hydraulic hiss, its barrel depressing toward the horizon. Batteries released. Sector 1. The tactical officer barked. The gun fired with a bone-shaking crack that sent a pressure wave rippling across the sea's surface. A 70-pound high-explosive shell punched into the lead boat, detonating on impact. It disintegrated. A tower of white water, orange flame, and shattered fiberglass fragments was thrown 50 feet into the air, leaving nothing behind but a slick of burning fuel. 5 miles to the east, the suicide drones began their terminal dives. The Lincoln's close-in weapon system, the R2-D2, shaped 20mm Gatling gun, spun to life with a mechanical growl. It unleashed a continuous stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 75 bullets per second. The sound was a steady, terrifying buzz like a giant circular saw cutting through sheet metal. The lead drone was caught in the stream and literally shredded in midair. Its wings were sheared off, and the remaining fuselage tumbled into the ocean in a ball of fire. 2 more drones followed, their fuel tanks erupting as the tracer rounds stitched across their frames. The heat from the low altitude explosions washed over the Lincoln's starboard side, the air suddenly smelling of scorched electronics and the chemical bite of burning plastic. The defense was a chaotic, multi-layered wall of steel. On the carrier's catwalks, sailors manned the Mark 38 25mm chain guns and M250 caliber machine guns, their tracers creating a web of red light that crisscrossed the water. The sea around the strike group was boiling with the impact of thousands of rounds. One Iranian boat managed to fire a salvo of 12 107mm rockets. They streaked toward the Lincoln, leaving erratic trails of gray smoke. 3 were intercepted by the carrier's decoy systems, their guidance confused by clouds of burning magnesium flares, while the rest splashed harmlessly into the water. 500 meters short of the hull, the Iranian swarm began to hesitate. The Ababil drones were being picked off, one by one, their low-altitude approach making them easy targets for the ship's automated sensors. The fast boats, seeing their lead elements vaporized by the destroyer's 5-inch shells, started to break formation. They began to circle at a distance, realizing that the wounded giant still had a perimeter that was virtually impenetrable to light surface craft. The smell of salt water was now heavily masked by the overwhelming stench of cordite and the greasy black smoke rising from a dozen burning boat hulls scattered across the waves. Inside the Lincoln's Combat Information Center, the tension began to ease, though no one relaxed. The tactical display showed the remaining Iranian boats retreating toward the coastline. The 1,000 Stings had failed to land a single significant hit. The strike group's defensive coordination had held, proving that even a damaged carrier was a formidable fortress when supported by its escorts. The carrier's list had stabilized at 2 degrees, and the firefighting teams reported that the hangar deck was now clear of active flames. The sun was now high enough to reveal the true scale of the morning's violence. The sea was littered with debris, floating orange life vests, charred pieces of fiberglass, and the shimmering iridescence of spilled oil. The USS Abraham Lincoln continued its steady course south, its engines still, humming with a deep, rhythmic vibration. The swarm had been broken, but the ship was still 300 miles from the nearest friendly port, and the most difficult part of the journey, sustaining a crippled vessel in a combat zone, was just beginning. 8:15 in the morning. The Arabian Sea, 100 miles south of the Iranian coast. The immediate violence of the missile impact and the surface swarm had passed, replaced by a much more grinding, mechanical crisis: the survival of a wounded 100,000-ton city. The USS Abraham Lincoln was currently burning through its supplies of fire suppression foam and emergency electrical components at an unsustainable rate. Its port side list had been arrested, but the drag from the twisted hull plating was causing the reactors to work harder than they had in a decade. To remain in the fight, the carrier needed a lifeline. That lifeline appeared on the horizon in the form of the TAOE-6, the USNS Supply, a fast combat support ship carrying thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and critical repair parts. The maneuver, known as underway replenishment, is one of the most dangerous non-combat operations a Navy can perform, and doing it with a damaged hull in a potential combat zone pushed the risk to the red line. The Lincoln and the Supply began to close the distance, their massive hulls creating a Venturi effect, a physical force that tried to suck the two ships together into a catastrophic collision. The ships leveled out at a distance of only 180 feet, moving in parallel at a steady 15 knots. The Arabian Sea was running with a 3-meter swell, causing both vessels to roll and pitch in a rhythmic, uncoordinated dance that strained every cable and winch. "Shot lines away!" a sailor shouted from the Lincoln's midship station. A pneumatic gun fired a weighted rubber projectile across the gap, trailing a thin nylon line. This line was the first connection in a complex web of steel and rubber. Within minutes, heavy spans of braided wire were stretched taut between the two ships. Massive black fuel hoses, each 7 inches in diameter, were winched across the void on robotic trolleys. The air between the ships was suddenly thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, salt spray, and the faint, sweet scent of the hydraulic fluid powering the tensioning winches. The replenishment was not just about fuel. The Lincoln's hangar deck was a graveyard of aviation electronics that needed immediate replacement. High-speed cargo drops began moving across the wire. Pallets of specialized radar components, circuit boards for the F-35 Charlie, and drums of aqueous film-forming foam were shuttled across the churning water. Below the flight deck, the vertical replenishment was also underway. An MH-60 Sierra helicopter, the Seahawk, hovered over the supply's aft deck, hooked a net of supplies, and swung it over to the Lincoln's flight deck in a continuous, buzzing cycle. The environment was a symphony of high-tension machinery. The steel cables hummed with a low-frequency vibration. As they took the strain of the shifting seas, the personnel on the deck worked with a grim, focused speed, their faces sprayed with salt water and their gloves slick with grease. They knew that as long as they were connected to the support ship, the warship was a sitting duck, unable to maneuver or defend itself effectively if another weapon appeared on the horizon. The escorting destroyers USS Ralph Johnson and USS Mason circled the two giants like nervous sheepdogs, their ANSPY-6 radars scanning the sky with maximum intensity. Deep inside the carrier, the arrival of the repair parts allowed the engineering teams to begin the permanent shoring of the breached hull. They used high-capacity submersible pumps to finally clear the water from the auxiliary machinery spaces, the sound of the engines becoming clearer as the water level dropped. The smell of stagnant seawater was slowly replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of hot oil and circulating air. The medical team also received a fresh supply of plasma and specialized burn dressings, allowing them to stabilize the most critically injured sailors for eventual evacuation. By 9:45 in the morning, the breakaway ceremony began. The last fuel hose was disconnected, the remaining pressure in the line sending a mist of JP-5 fuel into the air before the coupling was sealed. The USNS Supply sounded its whistle, a deep, booming blast that echoed across the water and turned hard to starboard. The Lincoln, now replenished and with its damage stabilized, felt the surge of power as its reactors were brought back up to 60%. The ship was still wounded, and its port side was a jagged mess of scorched steel, but the lifeline had been delivered. The supply had done its job, leaving the carrier strike group to face the final assessment of the morning's war. 12 noon on the 15th of March, 2026. The Arabian Sea. The sun was high in a cloudless sky, beating down on the scarred flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The carrier strike group was now steaming south, at a steady 22 knots, moving toward the deep water maintenance facilities in the Seychelles. The immediate threat of the Iranian long-range batteries had been neutralized, and the air over the Arabian Sea was finally quiet. But the silence was heavy with the weight of the morning's cost. On the bridge, the commanding officer stood by the navigation console, looking out over the bow. The ship was still leaning 2 degrees to port, a permanent reminder of the 7,000-mile-per-hour impact that nearly broke in the back of his vessel. The after-action report was being compiled in real time, the numbers written in the cold, clinical language of military assessment. The United States Navy had suffered its most significant combat loss in a single engagement since the Second World War. On board the Lincoln, the casualty count was finalized. 42 sailors killed in action, 68 seriously wounded, and 12 still missing in the flooded lower compartments. The hangar deck was a total loss in the midship section, with 14 F-35 Charlie Lightning, 2 fighters, and 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The total financial cost of the damage to the ship and its air wing was estimated at $4.8 billion. However, the strategic mission, the defense of the strike group, and the neutralization of the threat was a qualified success. The Iranian 3rd Missile Brigade had been effectively erased from the order of battle. The retaliatory strikes by the F-35s and the Tomahawk missiles from the destroyers had destroyed 12 mobile launch vehicles, 16 radar installations, and 3 underground command and control bunkers. Iranian casualties were estimated at 240 personnel, with the destruction of 35 fast attack craft, and over 60 explosive drones during the failed swarm attempt. The Iranian hypersonic threat, while proving it could penetrate the most advanced defenses in the world, had been met with a response so overwhelming that their coastal strike capability was now non-existent. The atmosphere on the Lincoln was one of exhaustion and somber pride. The damage control teams, their faces gray with soot and fatigue, finally emerged from the lower decks. They had saved the ship through 18 hours of continuous, life-threatening labor. The air in the passageways still smelled of fire and salt, but the ventilation was clear, and the ship's primary systems were stable. In the ship's chapel, a small group of sailors gathered for a moment of silence, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic thrum of the nuclear turbines. They had survived a weapon that was supposed to be unstoppable, proving that while steel can be broken, the discipline of 5,000 sailors is a shield of its own. In Washington, the geopolitical fallout was only beginning. The engagement had crossed a threshold that changed the nature of naval warfare forever. The Aegis shield had been pierced, and the era of hypersonic combat had arrived with a terrifying lethality. Naval architects were already looking at the data from the Lincoln's hull breach, realizing that future ships would need entirely new methods of armor and energy-based defense. The Arabian Sea remained a vital artery for global trade, but it was now a place where the shadow of Mach 10 missiles would always linger beneath the horizon. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the USS Abraham Lincoln remained a formidable silhouette against the water. Its radar arrays continued to spin, and its remaining aircraft stood ready on the catapults. The carrier was wounded, but it was still a sovereign piece of American territory, moving through the deep blue water with a defiant persistence. The Battle of the Arabian Sea was over, leaving behind a legacy of fire, a list of the fallen, and the realization that the next conflict would be measured in seconds, not hours.